Alrighty. So let's get started. Uhuru comrades, and welcome to today's Omali Taught Me Sunday Study, featuring Chairman Omali Yeshitela. My name is Akile Anai, Director of Agitation and Propaganda for the African People's Socialist Party, as well as your MC for this morning. Today's study is highly important, and we encourage you right now to share the stream, invite your friends and family to it, so that as many of our people can be involved in this discussion. This week, the chairman reads chapters 1 and 2 from the book Vanguard, the Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, the political report to the 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party. We are kicking off a series where we will be showcasing the practical work of our party tied to the theory of African internationalism. We have, over the last few weeks, been discussing the importance to unite theory with practice, and we in the party have a saying, it's not what we say, it's what we do. The party has existed for 49 years, and since our founding has not only brought revolutionary theory to our struggle for African liberation, but has established actual processes, protocols, practices, and institutions to help us achieve our revolutionary aims. We have been laying the foundation of a liberated African economy and government of a united socialist Africa. In this study, we define in depth what the Vanguard is and why the African People's Socialist Party has assumed this role over the African Revolution. It's my honor now to introduce our leadership, the leader of the African nation and the worldwide African Revolution, our chairman, Omali Yeshitela. Uhuru, Chairman.
Uhuru, thank you, Comrade Akile. Brothers and sisters and comrades, as Director Akile has just indicated, we're going to be looking at 2 chapters from the political report to the 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party. That's a big chunk that we're going to be trying to deal with at one time. Usually it's impossible even to get through a chapter on one occasion, but we're going to try to do this, and I'm going to try to be expeditious. Our objective is to really help people understand, first of all, the party. What is a political party? Why do we have to have a political party? And we want to expose to people outside of the party, and perhaps even remind people in the African People's Socialist Party of the significance of our organization. We declare unambiguously, without hesitation, without any apology, it's indisputable in our minds anyway, that the African People's Socialist Party is the most significant mobilization, organization, event in the history of our struggle for liberation since the movement that was organized and organization pulled together by Marcus Garvey 100 or so years ago. We have taken it upon ourselves to finish this incredible revolution that began in the 1960s. People sometime today over social media and sometimes in various organizations talk about fondly about the 1960s, and they remember the Black Panther Party. And all of this is generally something that's done to evoke a certain kind of nostalgia about the movement, or they see the 60s as a kind of event, but not necessarily recognizing what it meant in terms of the overall struggle that we and peoples around the world were making against a social system that came into existence through slavery. White people, white power owe their success in the world that we experience and other people experience through slavery. It was the enslavement of African peoples, the attack on our Africa, and then subsequent to that, the incursion into other territories and countries, and the capture of those people and those resources that is responsible, again, for the success of white power. A whole system was born of that. We exist and function inside of the system that came from this process. And our party understands this. We don't attribute anything to spooks and goblins and religion and Allah and Jesus or et cetera. We think that there's a material basis. We know that there's a material basis for our conditions. This is what informs how we move and what we do and what we've been doing for the last 50 years or so. And so this is what has told us clearly that we have to have a political party, that we cannot spend another 200, 300, 400 years just trying to win white people to like us by fighting against some nonsensical fight against racism or something to that effect. That Africans have a profound, important, dignified history, and that we do a disservice to that history, to our people, when we find ourselves calling on our bellies and what have you, begging people to like us and accept us and in some kind of fight against racism. So we're going to go, and I'm going to try to read expeditiously. And then what we're going to do is, this beginning next week, we're going to show more concretely what it is that you have with the African People's Socialist Party, what the African People's Socialist Party means to us in terms of the liberation of our people, our continent, and the overturning of this parasitic socialism that brought white power into existence. And so we'll do this quickly today. Then the next couple of weeks, we're going to show more concretely what it means and how important the African People's Socialist Party is to you, to Africa, African people, and to the world. So I'm going to begin and apologize before I begin about the fact that I'm going to do a lot of reading, and I'm going to try to do it as expeditiously as possible. Though I know that I'm going to have to stop occasionally in this process to make a couple of points that I think are critical to an understanding of this party and why this party is so important, and the need for a political party, the meaning of political parties, the meaning of having a correct political line, why revolution has to be a consequence of a correct theory and that kind of thing. So Uhuru comrades, delegates, observers, remember, this is a political report that was made to the 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party. This is a report that it speaks directly to the members of the party at that Congress. And in fact, it's something that we had published months prior to the Congress for further discussion and development, but here is the report. So we say, Uhuru comrades, delegates, observers, and supporters of the 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party. During the 5 years since our 6th Congress, there have been many changes in the world and within our party. All of them have served to reinforce the significance of the African People's Socialist Party, which for more than 46 years has provided leadership for the African nation and oppressed and exploited workers of the world. Comrades, this 7th Party Congress constitutes a firm salute to the indefatigable work of the African People's Socialist Party to forward the struggle for the liberation and unification of Africa and African people under the leadership of the African working class. The continued unrelenting dedication of our party to complete the Black Revolution of the 60s is alive in the theme of this Congress, the African People's Socialist Party, Vanguard, Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution. Although our assertion that we are the Vanguard and Advanced Detachment sets us apart from other organizations, it is not something said in contention with others. This is a declaration to you, the members of our party, calling on you to recognize the magnitude of your party membership and the role you have volunteered to carry out in the struggle for the liberation and unification of Africa and African people worldwide. This is an incredible struggle that we volunteered to take on. Africa has been under colonial domination for centuries. And for the last 600 years, at least, it has been the source of the development of the capitalist system itself, the growth of power of white people and the growing immiseration of African people, and it has been the fuel for the emergence of a new social system, a world economy that again has its origin in enslaving African people, dividing and stealing our resources and dispersing Black people all around the world to work from different locations to build white power. An example of an advanced detachment is a unit or a group of soldiers that goes out first to lead and pave the way for the army in battle. For our party, the advanced detachment or Vanguard means that we have freely and enthusiastically stepped forward to lead the struggle for the total liberation and unification of Africa and our entire dispersed African nation, wherever we are located. Unlike any other African organization on the planet, our party is very serious about seizing African state power on our African continent. Our goal is to wrest back our land, our stolen resources, and the value of our stolen labor under the leadership of the African working class in a liberated socialist Africa. We understand that no oppressed people has ever become free without the intervention of an organization. We understand that no oppressed people has ever become free without the intervention of an organization of trained, disciplined cadre who are committed to winning the liberation by overcoming every obstacle, including our own limitations. We are a party of professional revolutionaries. Our members have a variety of occupations. We are school teachers, barbers, construction workers, taxi drivers, and the like. We are also students, prisoners, African workers, and welders. We are cooks and even lawyers, but whatever our occupation, our profession is revolution. We are not dilettantes simply committed to faddish political work in our spare time. In fact, our profession as revolutionaries guarantees that there is no spare time when we are not advancing the struggle for the liberation of our people. This is what is meant. This is what it means to be the Vanguard, the advanced detachment. The African People's Socialist Party was created to complete our revolution that had been crushed by a vicious US-led counterinsurgency that defeated the Black Revolution of the 60s as it expressed itself globally. There was no other organization in the African world that both survived the counterinsurgency and took up the task to go beyond survival and mere adaptation to our inherited conditions of defeat. Our party was bent on advancing the revolution, the struggle for the total liberation and unification of Africa and the forcibly dispersed African nation everywhere. We have done much advanced work to resolve the many theoretical issues that otherwise would have been left unresolved by the ruthless colonial capitalist defeat of our movement, just as the most important questions were surfacing in our struggle. We are practical revolutionaries. We are not an organization of consumers and dispensers of information. We have chosen to lead in every way. We have chosen to be the advanced detachment of the African working class. We have chosen to be the Vanguard. Our party understands that in order to change the world, to end our oppression, we must have the organizational vehicle to do so, and willing and trained cadre to carry out the task. This is why we are able to say African People's Socialist Party and Vanguard in the same breath. The African People's Socialist Party is boldly declaring our intent to forge the revolutionary process to defeat imperialism. We are not just talking, we are preparing to govern. We know parasitic capitalism was created and is maintained through its cruel, rapacious attachment to our Africa and our people. Our intention is to overturn it and replace it through a worldwide socialist revolution based in the forcibly dispersed international African nation wherever we are located. The success of our party is the critical factor in the liberation and unification of Africa and the entire suffering African nation. It is not a little thing. It is for this reason we were able to report to our party plenary in February 2012 that building the party is not only a crucial task of the African People's Socialist Party and our members, it is also the fundamental task of the African Revolution at this critical juncture. The African People's Socialist Party, the revolutionary vehicle. Years ago, in 1986, we summed up the qualities of our party that made it necessary to characterize the African People's Socialist Party as the Vanguard in the pamphlet Build and Consolidate the African People's Socialist Party. This was in 1986, this pamphlet was done. We paraphrased a statement by former Black Panther leader Huey P. Newton when he was a revolutionary during the Black Revolution of the 60s, which stated, quote, "The party must be the ox upon whose back the masses ride," unquote. We pointed out that two 19th century European revolutionaries, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, authored a similar statement saying, "The communists therefore are on the one hand practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country, that section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement," unquote. We noted that it was left to V.I. Lenin, the 20th century Russian revolutionary, however, to successfully build and lead the revolutionary organization spoken of by Marx, Engels, and later Newton. We quoted Lenin as saying, "Give us an organization of revolutionaries and we will overturn Russia." And we explained that Lenin set upon the task to build a revolutionary organization that indeed overturned Russia and became the prototype for revolutionary organizations of the oppressed and exploited people throughout the world. Such a party is the Vanguard, the advanced detachment of the working class. It is a party of communists, a party of a new type. Such a party is the African People's Socialist Party. Our task then, as now, is to unite our people under the leadership of the Black working class in the struggle for political independence, African liberation, and socialism. This political report must win the unity of our party members and participants in our 7th Congress to the recognition of the gravity of your role as cadre, the advanced detachment of the African Revolution. This political report will demonstrate the material basis to be found in the history and accomplishments of the party and our understanding of the acute crisis of the parasitic capitalist system, for having the confidence and courage to take up your proper role as leaders of the African Revolution. Our political report to the 2017 party plenary was titled "Putting Revolution Back on the Agenda." In this report, we began to show how the party is the advanced detachment. And I quote, "First of all, the imperialist crisis." This is 2017. First of all, the imperialist crisis, the uneasy equilibrium with which we have been contending, is manifesting itself with ever greater clarity in the political arena, especially as seen in the 2016 US presidential campaign and election. Secondly, the neo-colonial African assimilationist tendency of our community, while opposed to the election of Trump, is making every effort to support the colonial capitalist system. The assimilationists are doing everything possible to keep Africans loyal to the system and the electoral process, primarily to the ruling Democratic Party, from whence flows their economic security, semblance of power, and influence. The African People's Socialist Party is the revolutionary vehicle of the advanced detachment through which the conscious and organized African working class continues to wage the struggle for the socialist liberation and unification of our dispersed African nation. Instead of spontaneity, which allows the issue of the moment to determine our trajectory, our work is based on a plan stemming from a scientific theory. We continue to check up on our work, to measure our successes and correct our errors, to make certain that our practice reflects and validates our theory. So we said that instead of spontaneity, which allows the issue of the moment to determine our trajectory, our work is based on a plan stemming from a scientific theory. So we didn't get born. We didn't come into existence with the election of Obama. And many people, that's when they came to life, and that's when their politics began, and that's when their trajectory was initiated. Obama is elected, and therefore, what are we going to do? How are we going to take this on? Some people actually abandon all thought. Some so-called revolutionaries actually abandon any pretense of being revolutionary and said, we got to join Obama, we got to do this, or the country's going to go to fascism, or some other nonsense like that. Some people actually were frightened by the election of Obama, because now that Obama is elected, all the people are going to follow him, and that means that we're going to be in worse trouble than ever. And then there was, of course, the killing of Mike Brown that created another moment of epiphany, so that some people were rushed into St. Louis. Some people stood on the sideline and said, what we got to do is explain the thing about Mike Brown and explain this and explain that. And this was the thing that determined how they would move. And then some people, similarly, as I mentioned, dealt with Trump in a similar fashion. When Trump was elected, this is a new event that's going to start. We say that we are a revolutionary organization. And then there's the coronavirus, the COVID-19, the colonial virus that's been imposed on us also. We say this crisis started much earlier than that. It's been here. The problem is that the whole world economy is resting on a foundation of colonial terror, colonial imposition, the forced extraction of value from colonized and oppressed peoples around the world, in Africa in particular, and in African communities and barrios and among the indigenous people in various places. This is the crisis. This has always been there. And so that's what has informed our practice, and even the need to have a revolutionary organization and a revolution altogether. So the question for us is not, wow, now that Trump is elected, somehow we are facing disaster, or COVID-19, now we are facing disaster and what have you. The question is, how do we forge this revolutionary project, given how imperialism looks at this particular time, given what the balance of forces are at this particular time? How do we move the revolutionary project forward? And someone said, well, you just can't do that because things are so dangerous now with COVID-19, and they are dangerous. But the fact is they're dangerous to us all the time. Therefore, we have to have a revolutionary party and a revolutionary strategy and a revolutionary theory that informs us all the time, that is so comprehensive that it allows for all kinds of events to occur without taking us off point, and without now saying we got to start something new, as opposed to completing the revolutionary project that we started in the very beginning. So we say that instead of spontaneity, which allows the issue of the moment to determine our trajectory, our work is based on a plan stemming from a scientific theory. We continue to check up on our work, to measure our successes and correct our errors, to make certain that our practice reflects and validates our theory. So when we have our conferences, our meetings, our plenaries and what have you, we don't start the revolution with COVID-19. We say, how does the advent of this colonial virus impact on the strategy to win the liberation of African people? How does that affect it? We don't say, okay, now let's make the revolution, make the struggle revolving simply around COVID-19, around the colonial pandemic, the colonial virus. If it's not this colonial virus, it's going to be an earthquake that kills 300,000 people in Haiti. It's going to be a mudslide that kills more than 2,000 people in Sierra Leone. It's going to be police murder that kills at least one African a day in the United States. It's going to be the mass incarceration and imprisonment and concentration camps of Black people here and all around the world. I mean, all of those things are reflections of the colonial condition that we experience as a whole people, starvation, the mass rapes, and et cetera, that we experience in East Congo. All of those things are a reflection of being under colonial domination, and that's the struggle that we have to keep our eyes on all the time, and that's what we do as a party. The party Congress and our plenaries allow us to bring the membership of the party into this democratic process of charting our course. They grant the party leadership the authority to require centralized discipline from all our members and constituent organizations. The six-party Congress participants adopted the political report
after serious discussions that began more than 3 months prior to the convening of the Congress. The political report was truly a document of our whole party, and the task, the 5-year plan laid out in the political report constitutes the party direction that was voted for by the whole party. We didn't vote on COVID-19. We didn't vote on the colonial virus. We voted on making the struggle and recognizing the fact that there was a crisis of imperialism that manifests itself differently all the time. It was a crisis when China became such a contending force with them. It was a crisis with the success of Iran throughout the Middle East and Persian Gulf in contention with the United States. It was a crisis for them when Venezuela became increasingly successful, first under Hugo Chavez, and even as it now tries to move the movement. It was a crisis when Evo Morales became the leader in Ecuador. So they are faced with all kinds of crises all the time. And we are faced with dangerous crises all the time too, because of our attachment to this system. Therefore, it's going to also mean that we're going to face danger trying to get out of it. It was dangerous in Mississippi. It was dangerous in Florida. It was dangerous in Georgia when those of us who were involved in the struggle on the ground in these places against crackers who said, you don't even have the right to vote, to walk the street, to look white people in the eye, etc. It's always been dangerous. But there have been those of us, there have been those of our people, our community that have willingly stepped forward in order to make the struggle, of course, observing all the protocols necessary to provide the best kinds of protection for our forces, even as we made the revolutionary project, even as we took the revolution forward. And that's the same thing is true with COVID-19, with the colonial virus. We still got to make the revolution. We still have to accomplish the 5-year plan that we laid out in our Congress in October of 2018. So we say that our plenary process is the method the party has adopted to continue summing up our work of making our plan reality and guaranteeing that we do not veer off on some opportunistic gambit based on the whims of any party, organization, committee member, or leader. Unquote. The resolutions and mandates adopted at our Congresses safeguard our party against spontaneity and opportunism, factors that distinguish our party and contribute to its continuity, which is key to our strategic approach. And we say opportunism, we're talking about this ability to sacrifice the long-term interests of the revolution, the long-term interests of the African working class and the African nation, to sacrifice those long-term interests for some kind of short-term interest of the African petty bourgeoisie. So the long-term interests of our people continue to be the revolution. That continues to be the liberation of Africa. That continues to be the unification of Africa and African people around the world. That's the only way forward. And that is key to the destruction of capitalism and the advent of socialist revolution throughout the world. That's what we do. So COVID-19 doesn't change that. We don't say, okay, let's stop everything and do COVID-19 work. We don't say, because things are difficult now, let's forget that and do civil rights work. We don't say, because we are hungry, then the key thing that we have to do is give out food to the poor people. Hell, we say that overturning the social system is what will provide food for the poor people, and the long-term interest of the poor people, African people, and others is to advance this revolutionary project that we started on first some time ago, and that our Congresses and our plenaries continue to keep us on task around. So that's spontaneity when you do that. That spontaneity, which is what some have called the mother of opportunism, to abandon the long-term interest, to be taken off task and say, okay, this is what we got to do. And you hear it all the time. Well, yeah, we know in the long term, we know, yeah, that's the thing that's going to happen one day, et cetera, et cetera. Right now, right now, right now. What we do right now has to be attacked consciously, structurally, organizationally, ideologically, philosophically, to what it is that we are trying to do in the long run. Otherwise, it's just opportunism and just an ability of some slick talking person to find some way to unite with our oppression. So we say our Congresses and plenaries are critical because since the defeat of the Black Revolution of the 60s, more than 2 generations ago, the African People's Socialist Party is the organization that assumed custody of the revolutionary struggle of the African working class and peasantry, indeed of the entire African nation. We are the party that constitutes a historical continuum from the previous era of the Black Revolution of the 60s to its incipient resurgence today. Our mission has never been determined by the events of the moment. Events come and go. Elections are held. Coups overturn governments. Police violence escalates from time to time. Our struggle faces setbacks, but the social system that has arisen from slavery and colonialism remains the same. This is the essential ingredient that must inform our analysis during each period. Our congresses and plenaries contribute to our ability to hold the line, to protect, defend, and solve the problems of the revolution. This is what revolutionaries do. This is what a revolutionary party does. It is also true that the system of oppression under which the entire world and we live and struggle is a parasitic capitalist system that owes its existence to and is nourished by slavery and colonialism. The legitimacy of any movement of the oppressed must ultimately be judged by its opposition to slavery, colonialism, and the capitalist system birthed by slavery and colonialism. Our party is the custodian of the African Revolution. While the selection of Barack Hussein Obama as the first African US president and the August 9, 2014 police murder of 18-year-old Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri may have affected how we carried out our strategy and tactics, the reality of the parasitic capitalist colonial domination of Africa and the world remains the same. This reality shapes our worldview. It makes us African internationalists. We address the critical role of our party in the continuing process of solving the problems of the revolution in the political report to the 2016 plenary. Quote, since our inception in 1972, our party has functioned as the primary custodians of the African liberation struggle. We have summed up all the lessons and contradictions of our revolutionary movement to unite the African nation and liberate and unite Africa and African people worldwide under the leadership of the African working class. The African liberation movement suffered a major setback since the defeat of the Black Revolution of the 60s. Not only were giants like Patrice Lumumba of Congo and Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana brutally murdered and overthrown by repulsive, shameless, European-created neo-colonial stooges, but our movement was never able to resolve many of the key ideological and political questions facing our people. This demoralized our people whose dreams and aspirations were spoiled by the disillusionment that followed our movement's defeat and demise. Inside the US, it was left to our party to sum up the significance of the life and death of Malcolm X and Dr. Martin Luther King, and the destruction of the Black Panther Party, along with the accompanying assassinations and imprisonments. It was the African People's Socialist Party that forced the world to recognize that the African liberation movement is one struggle being waged across the globe on different fronts by a forcibly dispersed African nation held in colonial slavery in Africa and elsewhere over the last several hundred years. It was our philosophy, African internationalism, that brought this understanding to the forefront. Without African internationalism, it would be impossible to understand why Africans, sometimes called by an assortment of different names, suffer impoverishment, brutality, and imposed ignorance all over the world, unquote. As we state in the political report to our party's 2010 Fifth Congress, published as One People, One Party, One Destiny, quote, would capitalism and the resultant European wealth and African impoverishment have occurred without the European attack on Africa its division, African slavery and dispersal, colonialism and neo-colonialism? The answer is no, 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 and 1,000 times no, unquote. And then in the political report to the party's 2016 plenary, we clarified, quote, it was African internationalism that helped to locate the millions of Africans that otherwise would be missing from history by false national identities that facilitate our colonization everywhere and deny Africans the confidence and resources that come from recognition that as a nation, Africans are more than 1.5 billion strong. Our party, through practice and theory, continues up to now to help people understand that despite the ongoing efforts by the US to demonstrate otherwise, the Black Revolution of the 60s did not simply go away because our militants tired of struggle or came to enjoy our oppressed status in the United States. Our revolution was military defeated through assassinations, mass jailing, slander, and unrelenting harassment. In other words, or in a word, it was a war without terms that silenced our struggle. And this is something that I'm hoping will help people to recognize the significance of political prisoners who are languishing in these jails, those who are still alive, those hanging on to life by a thread, even without the advent of COVID-19. Special attention given to political prisoners. And from our perspective, of course, all Africans who are locked up in a colonial prison system are political prisoners. But specifically those forces who are conscious political prisoners, people who went into prison or after being in prison came to understand more about our struggle and our condition and began to organize to deal with it and were punished further because of that. So we say, this is the understanding that allowed the African People's Socialist Party to recognize that the African charlatans, including Barack Hussein Obama, were elevated to high places as neo-colonial substitutes for genuine revolutionary African leaders of the past. Sundiata Acoli alone, who's been rotting in a prison cell since the early 1970s, is 10 times more valuable to African people than charlatans and hustlers like Obama. Obama is a hustler and a traitor to Black people and a traitor to all the working masses of the world who thought that his selection by white power was going to mean something for us. But there are people who really struggle and continue to struggle and are in these prison systems and have been silenced as a consequence of that. We said, indeed, these charlatans, every one of them, are a result of the defeat of the revolution, not of its success. We have led and participated in campaigns throughout the US and all over the world informed by this understanding and instilled by practice that involve virtually every form of struggle. This is why we can confidently say we are the best prepared to lead our people to the reunification of the African nation and the liberation and unification of our African motherland. Unlike most who see the growing unrest roiling the world, the unremitting wars and the threats to US hegemony in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and increasingly the African domestic colony of the US with alarm, we of the African People's Socialist Party recognize this as an era of general imperialist crisis. And we say the same thing about the colonial virus. Certainly, this is why the political report to the party's 6th Congress was titled An Uneasy Equilibrium, the African Revolution versus Parasitic Capitalism, where we summed up, and I quote, the science of African internationalism enable our party to avoid the ideological pitfalls that validate the assumption of the superiority of white people. That is, say, the science of African internationalism enable our party to avoid the ideological pitfalls that validate the assumption of the superiority of white people. Thus, we have never been diverted from our mission of capturing power and uniting Africa and our nation under the leadership of the African working class. Our party brought science to our defeated African liberation movement at a time when it was generally bogged down in racial and cultural nationalism that indulged in candlelit ceremonies, religious obscurantism, and nostalgia for an often imaginary African past. Through African internationalism, we were able to discover the material basis for the exploitation and oppression of Africans and others in the world. With African internationalism, we can understand the material forces at work in the movement of history. We can clearly see the current shift in the balance of power between the oppressor and the oppressed, between Europe and the rest of us, between the so-called white man and the so-called black man. We recognize the reality that there is a great contest between an imperialist past that has defined the world for the last 500 years and a liberated future of a totally free and reunited African nation and the emancipation of the colonized peoples worldwide. Our party fights for the interests of the African working class. All societies contain an advanced sector. These are people who, for whatever reason, stand out because of their willingness to step forward to address the pressing problems found in society at any given time. That's all societies. It is they who generally attempt to sum up the areas of social concern and put forward solutions. The individuals who take on this important social task are those who comprise the advanced sector. Political parties are parties that are comprised of these individuals, but political parties are also parties of particular classes. In the development of capitalism, political parties have historically been representative of the colonial capitalist class. They represent the selfish interests of that class, even though the colonial capitalist class, because it is a minority exploiting class, must usually disguise its class rule as a popular will of the oppressed and exploited masses. It's important to make this point about the advanced sector, because hopefully it will help some people to understand this question that we are often confronted with inside and outside of our communities, about why African people tolerate this and tolerate that. Why don't we do like the white people do in dealing with these issues? And the fact is, because the bourgeoisie, the colonial capitalists, always work to silence the advanced sector of our community. Because like others, there is an advanced sector. There has always been an advanced sector. There's always been that group, those individuals who would step forward and try to provide leadership for the whole people all the time, that was try to sum up what these problems are and how we should deal with them. And that's where the government, the United States government, all imperialist capitalist powers have always done things like assassinate those who had the ability to do that, slander them, isolate them, do whatever the hell is possible to prevent them from being able to provide the kind of leadership that an advanced sector provides in any society, not just in African society. White people act a certain way as quiet as it's kept because they're constantly informed by that advanced sector, whether it comes in the form of newspapers, social media, the churches, et cetera, they are allowed to exist, generally speaking, to push forward the interests of the, first of all, the European nation, and secondly, of the bourgeoisie. When it comes to African people, we are gunned down, we are arrested, we are slandered, we are moved out of the way and substitute white people, that's to say, Africans who white people come to us in blackface. They provide this leadership to misdirect and take us in places we don't need to go. That's true of African people. That's the question. It's not because African people are dumber, somehow incapable of moving forward. It's because white power works all the time to identify and annihilate or undermine the leadership of the advanced detachment of our community and our organizational expression. Today, the African working class has our own organization that fights for the selfish interests of our class. Up to now, most of our political activism has taken place inside the ranks of the parties of our oppressors, the colonial capitalist rulers of society. They have been able to continue their rule because we have not had our own working class parties to advance our own selfish class interests that are diametrically opposed to the interests of our oppressors. And it is an issue that those people who seem to represent us most of the time are people who are connected one way or another to white power. It becomes a part of the advanced detachment of the white nation. It is the Negroes who you see in holding office that some people refer to sometimes as some kind of misleadership class. That's the African petty bourgeoisie. Those are neo-colonial forces who can be identified by their social location, their location in society in terms of their social location, and also because of their commitment to the interests of some other force, that's usually the colonial capitalist bourgeoisie. Today, the African working class has our own organization that fights for the selfish interests of our class. And so, as colonial subjects of imperialist white power, Africans have only had access to the electoral process since the 1960s. Before that time, our political interests were usually determined by the white colonial rulers or by the African petty bourgeoisie and organizations they established. And of course, this means subsequent to the invasion of white power into our lives. This is how we have usually fought to attain a power through the electoral process. In the US, some of these petty bourgeois-led organizations won popular acclaim because of their successful mobilization of the oppressed African masses to become directly involved in the movement for basic democratic rights under colonialism. Similarly, on the continent of Africa, it was the African petty bourgeoisie that rose to prominence in the quest for political independence within the capitalist system presided over by imperialist white power. While some of the demands of the pro-independence African petty bourgeoisie appeared to be radical, they were generally incapable of challenging the capitalist system that has its origin in our colonial domination. This meant that the outcome was a capitalist outcome that now had African management. Look at the ANC in what they refer to as South Africa. Look at your local Negro congressperson. A meaningful, notable exception to this was the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, that was organized by Marcus Garvey to pursue the liberation of Africans globally and the achievement of our independent capacity for self-government. Another notable exception to this was Dedan Kimathi and the Kenyan Land Freedom Army, or the so-called Mau Mau, that in the 1950s scared white power to death and scared the British to death, because it led to this incredible revolutionary movement in Kenya that was occupied by England, and forced the British to adopt a whole new tactic for maintaining the domination of Africa and African people. The UNIA organized branches throughout the world with a membership of 6 to 11 million Africans. It created groundbreaking economic institutions that included a steamship line, factories, recording companies, and a host of other economic projects intended to initiate a threatening, independent, anti-colonial international economy for African people. The Garvey movement was incessantly attacked by international imperialist white power, especially the US government that falsely charged and imprisoned Garvey before deporting him to Jamaica, his place of birth. While the UNIA never touted its working class constitution, it was the working class character of the Garvey movement that won Garvey the enmity of the African petty bourgeoisie of the era in the first quarter of the 20th century. Many of them, especially the distinguished W.E.B. Du Bois, cooperated with the United States government and others to destroy the Garvey movement, in part because of its Black working class composition. We are the Garveyites of the 20th century. Like Garvey, we do speak to the interests of the African nation as expressed through the interests and worldview of the independently organized African working class. The philosophy of the UNIA was African fundamentalism, not Pan-Africanism. The philosophy of the UNIA was African fundamentalism, not Pan-Africanism. The worldview of our party, 21st century Garveyites, is African internationalism. Again, not Pan-Africanism. As a party of the African working class, we were always consciously contending with the parties and interests of the oppressor nation and the exploiting capitalist class. The African People's Socialist Party is not the African working class. We are its advanced detachment, its general staff, its vanguard, which like the class parties of the oppressors looks out for the interests of the whole class, whether the whole class is at any given moment capable of recognizing what its class interests are. That's what parties do. The parties of the oppressors, the parties of the oppressed have to do the same thing in terms of looking out for the interests. That's the advanced detachment. That's what it means to be the advanced detachment. So that even when the class that we represent doesn't necessarily understand or recognize its own interests as their representative, as their advanced detachment, as the general staff of the African working class, it is we who do that. It is we who represent their interests all the time. Now, African masses are busy trying to do everything they can to survive under the colonial conditions imposed on them by white power. Their advanced detachment then, those who come from, represent that class, then we have the responsibility to summon that up and provide and looking out for the interests, advancing the interests, I should say, of that whole class. So don't confuse the party with the class. We are it's the advanced detachment. So the African People's Socialist Party, as we said, is not the African working class. We are its advanced detachment and its general staff, its vanguard, which like the class parties of the oppressors looks out for the interests of the whole class, whether the whole class is at any given moment capable of recognizing what its class interests are. The African working class is always in a posture of resistance. This is most obvious in the behavior of young working class Africans who consciously defy convention that usually defines how reasonable and civilized behavior should look. They are constantly breaking out of the social boundaries imposed on our community by colonialism. And in many cases, they set new social and cultural trends, which after the initial strong ruling class and African petty bourgeois denunciation are co-opted by proper colonial society. I mean, you hear hip hop now on billion-dollar advertising, billion-dollar corporations. The resistance of the African working class can be seen in the spontaneous rebellions and threats of rebellion that require an oppressive presence of the domestic colonial military police waging barely disguised war in every African community within the US and the entire world. When the African working class does not have access to its own African People's Socialist Party, their defiance is most often not politically motivated and directed. When it is occasionally politically directed, it comes under the influence of the white rulers, sometimes transmitted by radical sectors of the African petty bourgeoisie. We have seen this recently in the aftermath of the 2014 uprising in St. Louis, Ferguson, following the colonial police murder of Mike Brown. We have also seen the results of this indirect ruling class influence over the masses of African workers in occupied Azania or South Africa, with the rise of the African National Congress, Nelson Mandela, and a host of other radical sectors of the African petty bourgeoisie. Similarly, African working class protests are roiling the African continent, including the Democratic Republic of Congo. The weakness of the African Revolution is again exposed by the fact that the majority of African working class and poor peasantry do not have the advantage of the African People's Socialist Party, its own party fighting for the selfish interests of the colonized African working class. The African People's Socialist Party has been the instrument of the African working class that continues to rally the class to its own interests, to its own side, so to speak. However, our party is not only the advanced detachment of the African working class, but as we have said before, we are the vanguard of the entire African national revolution. We have accepted the responsibility of liberating Africa and the entire forcibly dispersed African nation that suffers under the cruel weight of colonialism everywhere. The African People's Socialist Party is the leadership of the African working class, the most consistently revolutionary component of the African nation. But because the African working class is the main social force of a colonized African nation, our responsibility is greater than simply leadership of the working class. The leadership of the advanced detachment of the African working class is and an absolute necessity for the liberation of the entire colonized African population, including the African petty bourgeoisie that has an entirely different definition of what liberation means. The African petty bourgeoisie wants equality with the colonizer, preferably with the colonial ruling class. One sector of the African petty bourgeoisie wants to get rid of the colonizer and its domination of the African nation. It is a patriotic sector of the African petty bourgeoisie because of its opposition to white colonial domination. However, this sector is not interested in overturning the system of capitalism that was created through colonial slavery. In the political report to the party's third Congress, held in St. Petersburg, Florida in 1990, we defined the difference between the petty bourgeois national liberation and the national liberation of the African working class. Although this passage speaks specifically to the situation of the US domestic colonialism of our people, the principle is universal. And I'm going to quote from that. The national liberation of the so-called national liberation of the aspiring Black petty bourgeoisie is a so-called liberation from the limitations of its development into a full-blown bourgeoisie, limitations which are imposed on it by domestic colonialism, the imperialist rule by foreign gangsters. Within this concept of national liberation is the germ of a future continued exploitation of the African working class by a Black bourgeoisie that has been liberated from the national oppression which prevented the emergence of a free, independent Black boss. Such a national liberation is not in the interest of the colonized African working class. The national liberation of the working class is a liberation which will sweep away all forms of oppression and exploitation. The national liberation of the domestically colonized African working class is not only interested in removing the oppression of foreign rule, it is interested in destroying the class rule which exploits the workers and toiling masses of all countries where the capitalist system prevails. The national liberation of the working class is explicitly anti-capitalist and consciously part of the worldwide socialist movement, unquote. In many writings, we have often quoted V.R. Lenin, the Russian revolutionary who designed the Vanguard party that has influenced the definition of revolutionary parties since that time. The African People's Socialist Party is a Leninist type party based on democratic centralism. Lenin stated, "We are the party of a class, and therefore almost the entire class should act under the leadership of our party." In the pamphlet, Build and Consolidate the African People's Socialist Party, we explain, following the quote from Lenin, however, quote, however, within the domestically colonized population of the US, the two main contending social forces are the Black working class comprising 88 to 94% of the population, and the primitive Black petty bourgeoisie, which generally speaking, has an inordinate amount of influence presently due to the military defeat of the Black Revolution of the 60s. Its influence is also tied to one or another sector of the colonial white ruling class or the capitalist colonial state itself. In the past, when the political activity and ideology of the Black petty bourgeoisie was generalized as an anti-colonial struggle for democratic rights, the Black petty bourgeoisie constituted a progressive influence within our movement. However, with the victory of the struggle for democratic rights, which came as a concession to the Black petty bourgeoisie and at the expense of the Black Revolution of the 60s, the Black petty bourgeoisie realized its fundamental political aim and lost any historically derived progressive character it once had. Thus, the mantle of leadership, both for the struggle for national liberation and socialism, has fallen upon the shoulders of the most despised and feared Black working class. Therefore, as the advanced detachment of the Black working class, the African People's Socialist Party assumes the leadership not only for almost the entire class, but also for almost the entire people, unquote. This is why we say we are the advanced detachment or vanguard of the African Revolution. The fact is that we are involved in a struggle for national liberation, within which there is also a raging class struggle. that grows sharper with the crisis of imperialism. The revolutionary aspirations of our people for happiness, the return of hundreds of years of stolen resources, and the construction of a socialist system wherein material want can be conquered will be determined by the African working class having its own independent political vehicle, its advanced detachment leading the struggle. The revolutionary aspirations of our people for happiness, the return of hundreds of years of stolen resources, and the construction of a socialist system wherein material want can be conquered will be determined by the African working class having its own independent political vehicle, its advanced detachment leading the struggle. We are that vanguard. It is the profound duty of the leaders and members of our party to eagerly, enthusiastically accept this responsibility at this Congress, to take our party and people to the future that Africans desire and deserve. The US government is currently the wounded, reactionary chief imperialist regime of the world that led the counter-revolutionary response of international imperialism to crush the liberation struggles of the peoples during the period of the 1960s, when revolution was the main trend in the entire world. At our 1972 inception, the African People's Socialist Party inherited a political terrain that was characterized by the fact that the masses have been shot and jailed out of political life. Revolution is characterized by the mass unbridled participation of the oppressed people in political life. And it was the defeat of the Black Revolution of the 60s that ended this mass participation. Our party has been busy organizing with the intent of reintroducing the people to political life. We have created various organizations to win the active participation of African people to the task of overturning the colonial government's violent program to prevent us from rising up again. An example of such an organization is the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement, NPDA. Programs to prevent or crush anti-colonial resistance are called counterinsurgency programs. Counterinsurgency employs every form of warfare, psychological, economic, political, etc. However, all counterinsurgency relies on military force in the final analysis. Central to most counterinsurgency programs is what the colonial power calls population and resource control. This is why the prisons are filled with Africans who might be otherwise available for revolutionary organization. This is also why there is an unrelenting murderous presence of colonial occupying military police in every African community in the US and most places in the world. Unlike the US colonial government, however, our party has always understood that it is only a matter of time before the African working class reclaims our station at the forefront of the revolution. This is why we never forsook revolution for some opportunist substitute. When Mike Brown was murdered by a white nationalist citizen in police uniform, it proved to be the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back. It ignited a fierce resistance among the young African working class in St. Louis, Ferguson, that mobilized Africans throughout the US. Our history and the sixth Congress of our party prepared us for this moment of imperialist crisis and rising consciousness among many sectors of the colonized African nation. Since our sixth Congress 5 years ago, our party has intensified our work on every front. We are winning. Comrades, delegates, brothers and sisters, we salute the history of unending resistance of our people and the great advancement of the people's struggle under the unrelenting leadership of the Advanced Detachment, the African People's Socialist Party. I hope, I really hope that, that this has been a helpful chapter. As I reread this political report, you're reminded of the reality of where our struggle is in so many places in the world with the success of the imperialists in crushing our revolutionary project.
it's really important that we recognize that what happened to our movement with the defeat of the Black Revolution of the 60s, we were involved in some of the most profound ideological discussion in the whole world. The whole world of oppressed peoples and what might have been characterized as advanced countries saw the African Revolution as it was unfolding as being critical and saw what was happening with African people also in the United States as fundamental to the liberation of all the people in the world. That's how we were viewed in the 1960s. That's what happened. And then the US government initiated an incredible, fierce counterinsurgency against the whole revolutionary movement, certainly in the United States. It was important for them to crush the African Revolution in the United States, not only for because of what that struggle meant in terms of liberating African people, contributing to the liberation of African people in the United States, but also because the revolutionary trajectory of Africans in the United States affected everything the United States imperialism was trying to do around the world. As courageous and tenacious and determined as the Vietnamese Revolution was in Vietnam, part of its success is due to the fact that the African Revolution of the 1960s forced the United States government to have to fight on two different fronts, or more than two fronts. One thing it forced the United States to do was even to bring back troops from Vietnam to fight us in New Jersey and to fight us in Chicago to try to put down the resistance and rebellions there. It also armed the people's movements and revolution in Vietnam and other places ideologically against the United States. It helped to weaken the United States prestige and what have you around the world. What the United States was consciously doing to try to stop the African Revolution, a courageous, bold revolutionary movement. You think about this, when you saw little African children, you've seen some of the videos of the police using high-powered water hoses and things like that against children who were simply demonstrating to join a sellout, lick-spittle, colonial bourgeois party like the Democratic Party. You know about the bombings of our churches and the brutal assassination of leaders of African people. You know about the lynchings that occurred just for people who were trying to vote in what was supposed to be a democratic process. And this has a profound impact in the world. I mean, every day, it has also affected how the white rulers of this country have been forced to control media in even different ways, because all around the world, people saw, and we saw ourselves as African people, the courageous children and unarmed men and women who were facing thugs and the federal government and local state powers, just trying to win basic democratic rights, just trying to stop from being killed, lynched with impunity on the streets of this country. That happened. And so that was a really serious undermining of everything the United States was trying to do in much of the world, and certainly in pursuit of the war that it was making against the people in Vietnam. It had a major impact for Malcolm X to be able to go and speak to the Organization of African Unity, which itself was something that was created, or that was shaped by the intent of imperialist white power to prevent Nkrumah's success in uniting all of Africa into a single African government, under a single African government. But it was at a time of high colonial, anti-colonial resistance in the whole world. And so for Malcolm to be able to speak to the Organization of African Unity, which was unprecedented, and of course the Organization of African Unity has even deteriorated more since the murder, since the time that Malcolm spoke before them.
But that was a major attack on the image and the willingness of these African heads of state to allow U.S. Government participation in their countries. Today, you got something like AFRICOM, where almost every country on the continent of Africa is accommodating the United States government's attempt to control all of Africa. Of course, it wants these traitors and puppets, stooges, do this in order to protect their own interests, because all they got to do is cry terrorists and say we're fighting against terrorists, and then they can get the drones and they can get the weapons and from the United States government, from other imperialist powers like the French in particular, and the United States are doing in the Sahel and in places like that. You know, that was something that has come about subsequent to the growth, the deterioration of the revolution there. But Lumumba was killed, and Nkrumah was overthrown and killed, I'm sure about that. And others met similar fates. I mean, in South Africa, Robert Mangolisa Sobukwe, who was a really important democratic force in that country, contending with the notorious sellout Mandela and the ANC, was jailed and eventually murdered. You know, although they called it something else, just like they've done with so many other people they've killed. So the thing is, the revolution has to continue. And this is the trajectory that the party is on. We have not gone away from the revolution. The things that we were fighting for since the inception of our captivity, we fight for that today. We didn't get uncaptured at some time since we were captured. We're still living under in captivity, under dominant colonial capitalist social system. We still have all of our resources sucked out of Africa and virtually every community that we live in, as a consequence of being the foundation upon which the whole capitalist system rests today. So that if you see exploitation, you see a social system today, it has those same structures, economic and political structures that came about as the part of the conquest of Africa and our enslavement. They have just been developed, and sometimes they look a bit different, and sometimes they're harder to recognize, but it helps us in the party to know what it is that we're fighting for and what it is we're fighting against. And that's the message that we take out to masses of African people. I'm really happy to see that as we do these studies on Sundays, that African international studies are happening all around the world. I'm particularly proud of the studies that we see done in occupied Azania, or South Africa, as it's called, right there in the townships is where it's done. Carmen Asa Anpu is leading just really powerful studies there almost every morning. And now he has begun to do the studies in languages that are familiar more to people right there in that region, in that area. So sometimes Zulu and sometimes Xhosa, what have you, as well as English, and that's powerful. And he's calling on Africans and others to initiate these studies in other languages too, so that these studies and this understanding is becoming more widely spread throughout the world. African internationalism is the power. It is the way to the future. And I'm seeing studies happen in France, in Paris, and in England, led by current Secretary General Louisa Kinshasa, and sometimes in French, and sometimes in English, and sometimes in Lingala, one of the languages spoken in Congo. This is really important kind of development that we are seeing. And of course, within the United States, in various communities, we see a growth in intellectual activity where we are creating working class intellectuals, just as what we need. That's one of the things that's so powerful about the African People's Socialist Party, because there have been so-called parties of the working class in the past. And we've seen them a lot in Europe, and we've seen some of them in other places as well. I mean,
that's supposed to be part of the working class, and they often are. For example, even if you look at Cuba, you're talking about a revolutionary movement that was led in part by Che Guevara, who was a doctor from the petty bourgeoisie, Fidel Castro, who I think was a lawyer from the petty bourgeoisie. I think these are instances that Amilcar Cabral spoke to of where people have committed class suicide and abandoned the interests of the petty bourgeoisie and united with the interests and aspiration of the workers and peasants, etc. Cabral himself was from the petty bourgeoisie, but he represented the working class. He understood the significance of the working class coming to power. And that's why he talked about committing class suicide. You can't, that's what Dr. Aisha Fields of the African People's Socialist Party, who is a doctor and a physicist. When I say a doctor, I mean, in terms of having a doctorate in physics, and who heads up our COVID-19 commission, but also runs a shop, an economic institution that we've created right there in Huntsville, Alabama. She has committed class suicide. But she comes, from a family that has done that as well. And so we are doing these studies all over the world. And we are really creating African working class intellectuals for whom theory is shaped, determined by that reality. So it's not just some abstraction. And, I reflect on, even my own participation in the struggle for African people. There are some people today who call themselves revolutionaries, this and that, and it's hard for them to say, that there's class oppression. It's hard for them to say that the working class must rule. And even if they say the working class must rule, in many instances, in most instances, they seem to be estranged from the working class. But our movement was born in the working class. I was born in the working class. It was born in the heat of struggle of the oppressed peoples, and that's how it looks even today. So we are the Lumumbaists in Congo. We are the ones who carrying on the legacy and the efforts made by Nkrumah. We are the Garveyites. We are the ones who completing the project that was initiated by Malcolm X before he was gunned down by the CIA and assisted by traitors, as well. That's who we are. And we are going to move forward in the next a few weeks to explore this in, more deeply and to give the concrete kinds of examples that everybody needs, including us, in terms of from time to time to recognize the significance of the African People's Socialist Party and all of the work that we do and the power of the theory of African internationalism. So I'm going to stop it now and turn it back over to Director of Agitation and Propaganda, the amazing leader, Akile Anayi Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman. Uhuru, that was a brilliant study. I really want to appreciate it. And we have just an amazing audience today. And we do have lots of questions coming in, so I want to jump into that. But just really want to salute that amazing, powerful study, and really excited about this series that's going to really show the work of the African People's Socialist Party, really just everything that you just laid out, the party has been establishing, and we're going to put it all on, all on display for everyone to see. So really excited, and just want to appreciate everybody who's tuning in. Thank you so much on Facebook and on YouTube. And we want to encourage that you continue to share this live stream, invite your friends and family to it, and just get them involved in this discussion. It's not too late, and we're going to be getting to your questions right now. The chairman is going to answer your questions live. So want to go ahead and first recognize people who are watching in the various locations: Spokane, Washington; Louisville, Kentucky; St. Louis, Missouri; Kuwait; occupied Azania; Louisiana; Gainesville, Florida; Riviera Beach, Houston, Texas; St. Louis, Missouri; Minneapolis, Minnesota; Chicago, Illinois; Sierra Leone; Philadelphia, Pennsylvania; St. Petersburg, Florida; Hempstead, New York; Newark, New Jersey; Brooklyn, New York; Fort Myers, Florida; Tampa, Florida; Pinellas Park, Florida; Conakry, Guinea; Paris, France; and the Netherlands; And, if you want your play shouted out, please let us know where you are watching in the comment section. We have a couple of salutes. First, we have Chesh Adam saying, I want to be next to this great father. He is really, this is really the school of the revolution. I want to learn from this. And we have Comrade Matum, who's a Northern Regional Representative for our party, says, Uhuru, thank you, Chairman, for this study, and thank you for your leadership. And we're going to get to our first question, which is coming from Nasir Alamin in Kuwait. It says, question, I'm still struggling with understanding the chairman's reference to the material conditions and historical conditions for socialism. As I look at the history of socialist movements in the 50s through the 70s, socialism was influential in liberation struggles in Egypt, Algeria, Iraq, Yemen, Syria, Pakistan, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Ethiopia. So in general, is that the conditions were not there for socialism to remain and thrive in those countries? What does the chairman attribute to socialism's demise in those nations? Got to unmute.
Thank you. That's a really important question. It's one that's not generally understood because we've tried to make that point over a number of years. When we talk about the historical basis for the rise of socialism, it is something that the Marxists put forward in terms of the development of capitalism leading to a negation, if you will, of capitalism itself. That certain kinds of historical basis, historical development, that socialism comes into existence. But we're saying that historical basis for the rise of socialism never existed. What existed was the political conditions that allowed socialists to seize power. We're saying revolutions have happened in various places, but they haven't been socialist revolutions. Socialists have sometimes seized power. In Russia, that was not a socialist revolution. In fact, even before going into that, Lenin anticipated that, first of all, that Germany and other countries which are highly industrialized capitalist countries would be the ones that would make these revolutions, that constituted part of the historical basis for the rise of socialism, according to the Marxist philosophy. And it didn't happen that way. And Lenin even had to come up with the concept of the weak link to explain how it is Russia, that had not become industrialized the way the Marxists said it would occur, and would lead normally to socialism. It didn't happen. So Lenin created this concept of the weak link. Well, no, it's just that Russia was the weak link in the capitalist chain, and therefore it was able to break out. Never heard of the weak link before then. And then Lenin adopted what was the new economic program, NEP, as it was called. And this was, then they began to refer to as wartime communism, because it reverted to many of the capitalist principles that the socialism was supposed to eradicate. And there's a longer story to that than what I'm is trying to say as concisely as possible. What I'm saying is that the real material basis, the historical conditions for the rise of socialism can be found in the articulation by Karl Marx. And he said more than this, but he says that what do you call it, wage slavery or capitalist production and activity in Europe required as a pedestal slavery and pure and simple in the New World. Slavery, pure and simple, that was capitalism, that was slavery, and that we know now as colonialism that exists here and other places. And if you look at the world, it didn't unfold. History didn't unfold the way the Marxists and others thought it was unfolding when they even left us out of the equation. We became the so-called primitive accumulation that was simply an explanation for the development of European society, but it was not an explanation for the disparity, for the despair, for the rape and pillage that happened with Africa. So we're saying this whole thing rests on this foundation. And finally, we say we are on the eve of socialist revolution. And that is because the masses of people around the world in various countries and places are now making struggle that's depriving the parasite of its host. This is what you see, the weakening of capitalism is not coming about as a consequence of some development inside Europe. It's happening because of the struggles of oppressed peoples around the world. That's why you see the crisis. And even when you look at COVID-19, you're talking about ships being stalled across the world, bringing resources and supplies and things like that being stolen from the rest of the world, et cetera. They no longer have access to that. So in the real world, where Africans have been dispersed everywhere around the world, all over the Americas, in the United States, in Africa and what have you, the victory of socialism rests on us. That this is, we now find the material basis for the rise of socialism. The material basis for the rise of socialism is for the enslaved, the oppressed peoples, taking back our resource, and of course, doing that under the leadership of the African working class. That's the thing that's going to make the difference. That's the difference in socialists taking power and the conditions, material conditions for the rise of socialism being present. And now the material conditions are there. Now they are there. And that's why what we do now is so important. That's why theory is critical as well in terms of understanding the world. I hope I addressed that a little bit, comrade. I mean, there's a lot more, and we've written about it a lot more just in this brief period of time. I'm sure I wasn't as competent in explaining it as I would need to be. Uhuru.
He said he got it, Chairman. So I think that's good.
Good.
True. And people did let us know, some more people let us know where they were tuning in from. So we have Boston, South Africa, or occupied Tanzania, Baltimore, Maryland, London, UK, Hyattsville, Maryland, and Johannesburg, and occupied Tanzania just checked in. We have a question from Ifanyi George in Nigeria. Asks, what is the difference between Pan-Africanism and African fundamentalism ideology? You spoke about it briefly earlier.
Well, Garvey was characterized his philosophy as African fundamentalism. It was an assumption that Africa would be totally liberated, not Nigeria, not Bronx in New York, Houston, Texas. Didn't see it as these little separate entities out there. Garvey was to take power. His notion was Africa for Africans at home and abroad, so that Africa was the homeland for all African people, and we were part of a single organization, not a bunch of people who call themselves Pan-Africanists. And Garvey's movement was comprised essentially of African working class. And that was one of the reasons why it was hated by Pan-Africanists. And the Pan-Africanist movement itself, as a political movement, was something that was developed by W.E.B. Du Bois, and it was developed in opposition to Garvey's interest in Black people taking Africa and all of our resources. That's why it came into existence. W.E. Du Bois, as brilliant as and erudite as he was, worked with the United States government to help destroy the Garvey movement, to destroy African fundamentalist organization. And African fundamentalist was the movement of Garvey that was a massive organization that had something like from 6 to 11 million members. And Du Bois' Pan-Africanist organization was an organization of African petty bourgeoisie. It was a middle class organization. It was an organization that worked with the French and with the understanding that they allowed the first Pan-Africanist Congress to happen in Paris in 1919, as long as French colonialism wasn't criticized. And one of the main forces to help make that happen was a man named Blaise Diagne, if I pronounced the name right, who even though he was from Senegal, he worked as a sellout, neo-colonial force, and was a part of the French Parliament, and traveled all over Africa to get the Africans to fight for France in so-called World War I, or the first imperialist World War. And so they collaborated. And it was an anti-African effort. It was something to protect French colonialism and to protect colonialism in general. And Du Bois himself made such statements as that, saying that he was quite friendly with the colonial powers, et cetera. So the point is that this Pan-Africanism, you can be a Pan-Africanist capitalist, you can be a Pan-Africanist, call yourself a socialist, you can be any kind of force that calls itself a Pan-Africanist, works against the masses of African people, is not for liberation, never has been, never can be, and it does not even have on the agenda the seizure of state power. You seldom see that. We saw Pan-Africanism, the damage it did to our struggle in Ghana. We saw the damage it did to our struggle in South Africa, because Nkrumah characterized himself initially as a Pan-Africanism, was based on certain principles of pacifism, both in South Africa and in Ghana. It did not recognize the existence of class struggle and class exploitation, et cetera. So those are just some of the things that differ. We are a revolutionary organization. We are an organization of communists. We are an organization that recognizes that all the borders have to come down. There is not going to be some kind of Pan-Africanist entity in South Africa or Pan-African. In fact, South Africa has to be destroyed, and Nigeria has to be destroyed. We African, the working class, we don't have any country. Our country is the one that we're in the process of forging right now, total liberated Africa and African people under the leadership of the African worker class and the poor peasantry. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Chairman. So these next two questions I'm going to kind of combine because they're related, but it's from, one question is from Marissa and one is from Kashama. And Marissa asked, Chairman, can you lay out the role of the African nation in the China and US conflict? And then Kashama's question was, Chairman, I'm glad you mentioned China as a current contender with white power. What are your thoughts on the analysis of communism and China's history of resisting white power imperialism and reconciling the understanding of China's oppressive relationship with African people as contenders with white power?
Well, the thing is that Africa is up for grabs. Anybody wants it, Africa's up for grabs. And while we might be talking about China as a force and a contender in this instance, the real contradiction is that Africa does not have a unified revolutionary party, and that not universally recognized revolutionary theory. That's why this comment was just talking about Pan-Africanism, something dead from that never has worked. And the only reason we're talking about Pan-Africanism today is because of the success of the Pan-Africanists and the United States government in destroying the movement that was led by Marcus Garvey. So the problem that we have when we look at the issue of China's intrusion in Africa is the fact that Africa is not capable at this point. That's what we're working on, to unite, give Africa organizational and ideological unity so that we can be the formidable force that we need to look out for the interests of Africa. China has its own philosophy. China has its own interests. Its own interests as a Chinese nation is to build and develop China. And that's what it's doing. And it's doing doing whatever is possible to do to make that happen. That's why it's contending with the United States, because the Africa is this has always been historically, it's the founding of the whole capitalist system. And every time you see the capitalist economists any place in the world, they're in trouble, they run and can continue to suck the blood of Africa. They've been doing this for 600-700 years. And so that's where it all comes from. And Africa does not have access to our own resources. So China is a factor, and China was a revolutionary power especially during the early periods and during the height of Mao Zedong's leadership. And one of the things that made China so impressive and powerful, as quietly as it's kept, because it was never spoken of that much, and even the Chinese didn't talk about it in that way, is that China broke from the from the Marxist model that presupposed that Europe would be the center of the revolutionary movement because of the same thing we were just talking about, because of the industrialization and the development of capitalism inside Europe. And Mao, how can somebody with any intellect at all be living in the middle of 1 billion damn people who are mostly peasants and what have you, catching hell, starving, et cetera, saying the leadership has to come from the industrial countries? Mao, even in the Communist Party of China, he broke all the rules and sometimes involved in serious struggles inside that party, put out of power at different times because he moved from that model that was being put forth from Moscow and actually developed a theory that would liberate China, that would liberate and unite and liberate China. That's what Mao did. And at the time he did it, the communist movement was really an incredibly powerful movement that recognized the solidarity of the workers of the world in practice, not just in theory. And China was was one on the forefront of that. In fact, ran into serious kinds of struggles with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union precisely because of where China stood. And the only thing that came close to that subsequently has been what we've seen in Cuba. Real, genuine communist movement. Now we see that you cannot distinguish, and this has been true for a while, and this is because of the flaw in the Marxist theory that did not recognize that key to the rise of socialism was the emancipation of the exploited and oppressed colonized peoples of the world. That's the thing that's going to take us to freedom. And so there was an assumption that you get freedom. Once you get state power, you got freedom. You don't have anything but more poverty than under the leadership of a socialist or a communist kind of government. You got more, you got the same poverty because you isolated from the resources of the world that are capitalist. The thing that kept Europe and white power strong and powerful was the fact that they could suck the blood from all over the Caribbean and all over Africa and all these other places. And then with the European and white power imperialism, they were kept out of it. They couldn't. Russia didn't have access to the Caribbean, to South America, to the labor of Black people in Mississippi and what have you. The United States had that. Europe had that. The resources coming from India and all those places, that's what made them rich and powerful. And so China and Russia didn't have it. And so you can see some immediate benefits to the Russian Revolution because Russia Revolution happened in a semi-feudal country. So you had a situation where you still hadn't broke down feudalism inside Russia. So if you were in Russia, you were stuck on the land and you didn't have any ownership of the land. The peasants went to the land went to the peasantry with the Russian Revolution. When you were in Russia, workers couldn't expect to be anything all their lives. You had to be a part of the nobility to go to school. You had to be part of the nobility to become a doctor. You had to be a part of the nobility to have any kind of advancement in the Russian Revolution that happened. Then all of that broke down and rapidly the land started going to peasants, production enhanced amazingly, and people were able to go to school, get education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then it ran into a stone wall shortly after it moved through that feudal period because it did not have access to the booty that the imperial white power had in Africa, in the Caribbean, and in the rest of Asia. Except that's the thing that kept it afloat. And China ran into the same problem, had a magnificent revolutionary movement. It was incredibly significant and taught us how to engage in guerrilla warfare and to fight the imperialists, but it still was stuck in this era that had not, where we had not reached this critical mass where the struggle of the colonized people had come to where it is now. That's depriving the parasite of this capacity to live, and to the extent now that we can organize the oppressed people, the colonized people, then we we have the potential for real revolution. So in China, in Africa, the Chinese, I forgot exactly what that question was in terms of how it went in terms of China and Africa, but the future of Africa has to be determined by African people. It has to be determined by people who are African internationals who's going to make this revolution and capture political power, because we have to go beyond just having a discussion. We got to capture political power. We have to be committed to capturing political power. That means that we have to fight against those who control the political power and the economic resources of Africa. That's the only way for freedom. That's why you have to have a political party, which is the highest expression of the will of the people to seize and exercise political power. And so that's part of what it is that we're about. So China, has its own interests. And Africa does not have its own interests. It can't have its own interests because there is no Africa. There are 54 different entities that were created by white power, white people for their own advantage. And we are now in the process of creating Africa with the African Revolution, with the African Socialist International, with building the African People's Socialist Party and all those other places. Help me to understand more of this question that was raised, because I know I didn't deal with much of it.
So there was the two. There was one. The Marissa asked about. Oh, let me go back to it. Sorry. Asked about can you lay out the role of the African nation in the China and U.S. conflict? What the role of the African nation, I guess, would be or should be. And Kashama's question was your analysis of communism and China's history of resisting white power and reconciling the understanding of China's oppressive relationship with African people as contingent white power.
I think I might have said something about Kashama's.
Yes.
Glad to hear. Good to hear from you, Kashama, by the way. In terms of the role of Africa, I spoke essentially to the same thing, because the role of Africa has to be determined by African revolution. The African Socialist International is going to make this revolution as quiet as it's kept, because it won't happen automatically. It will not happen. Good wishes will not make it happen. It's going to take, dedicated cadre organized in revolutionary organization, armed with revolutionary theory. That's the thing that's going to make this happen. We have to take the power. There's no way we can get around that. And Comrade Marissa, that's the movement that you're a part of now. Our objective is to capture political power. China, India is there, Turkey is there, America is there, Canada is there. All kinds of forces are in there sucking the blood of Africa. But you know what? Because this is one thing I really appreciate, and this is part of what the Chinese Revolution taught us, by the way, in terms of people's war, is that you want to draw the enemy into your own territory, and you want to encircle your enemy. You want to cut off the supply lines to your enemy. And then with the right kind of organization, you harass them, you crush them, where they're weakest, you bleed them to death in your own territory. And that's what they're being in Africa. Capitalism was born in Africa, it's going to die in Africa, because we're going to crush it in Africa, we're going to kill it in Africa. And African people, including that brother in Nigeria who just talked to us about Pan-Africanism, because he's going to abandon that sellout kind of theory if he's been politic, it ain't a theory, and join with the African Socialist International, and we're going to defeat everything in Africa that shouldn't be in Africa. We're going to expel that virus. We're going to expel that virus, push it out of Africa, push it back where it came from, right? And then white people are going to have to get jobs. And that's going to be an extraordinary thing to behold.
I heard. Thank you.
They have to sing their own songs and do their own dancing and play their own football and take care of their own children and have their own babies, et cetera, et cetera. That's going to be a sight to behold.
All right. So we're going to take hopefully maybe like one or two more questions. We have there's a lot of engagement today. We have a question from Chairwoman Penny Hess of the African People Solidarity Committee. Asked, Rude Chairman, the party assumes the leadership not only for almost the entire class, but also for almost the entire people. Would it be correct to add for almost the entire world?
Yeah, because the socialists, listen, there have been certain things that's created that one would call conundrums, if you will, for Marxist and revolutionary theory. And one of them is the whole notion of socialism in one country. How the hell you're going to be in a sea of sharks and, somehow you're going to create your own little, secure island, I mean, it doesn't work that way. For socialism to come into existence, it becomes a part of the world economy in a way capitalism is a world economy. And this world economy starves the vast majority of the peoples of the world. The vast majority of the people of the world are starving. People going to bed hungry in a world of plenty, should be a world of plenty, et cetera. So that's the world we live in. But it's also a world where Africans have been dispersed everywhere. We're all over Africa. We're more than 1.5 billion strong generally. We're all over the Caribbean. We're in the Americas, et cetera. We're in the United States. We have the ability, making this revolution under the leadership of a single organization, single organized capacity, African Socialist International, calling ourselves the African People's Socialist Party US, the African People's Socialist Party Bahamas, the African People's Socialist Party France, the African People's Socialist Party Sierra Leone, African People's Socialist Party Occupied Tanzania, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have the ability to fight imperialism from all these different angles. And then in the process of fighting it, destroying it, then we have the ability, therefore, to create a defining economic reality. let's say the African Revolution seizing power. Now socialism has the ability to express itself worldwide, globally, through the success of the African Revolution. That's what we're talking about. That cures this whole question of socialism in one country. No, we're coming for the whole damn pot, the whole thing. And Africa is central to it, and the African Revolution is central to making that happen. It fractures the solidarity of the entire imperialist world. It fractures the solidarity inside the United States world, because we're working with the indigenous peoples here, Mexicans, other indigenous people here in this country and around the world, et cetera. So the whole imperialist world is going to be fractured as a consequence of the success of the African Revolution. And the African Revolution is going to be united under the leadership of the African Socialist International. Uhuru.
Uhuru. Thank you, Chairman. All right, so we're going to take one more question, and then we're going to go ahead and close it out. This is from Comrade Rashada Parks in St. Petersburg, Florida. Says, I was taking a GED class in 1975. There was only one speaker that ever came to talk to us. He was educating us on sickle cell anemia. When the regular instructor left the room, he stated that it came about because of experimentation of Africans regarding malaria. His not so quiet anger regarding this as he talked to us is what struck me the most and made me believe what he was saying. I have not been able to find out any info on this. Do you know anything about it?
No, I don't know anything about that, and that specifically. I do know that there is a host of various kinds of disease and experiments that's been made, that's been placed and made against Africa and African people. It happens every day. We function, Africa function in addition to everything as a certain kind of Petri dish. So that every experiment, that they want to make. You saw recently where the French doctors were talking on national television about finding a vaccine for the colonial virus in Africa, using Africa as a place to do it, just like they did with AIDS, they said, with prostitutes. So we know that that stuff happens. We know that birth control pills were tested where African people, or so-called Puerto Ricans, that became the way that they tested the birth control pills. So we are the laboratory that they use on a regular basis, and they create disease, they create designer diseases to kill us and do harmful things to us. And sometimes they do it in a really unemotional and objective way, not so much caring about the Africans, or they just is something they want to discover, something they want to learn how to do. There's something that they want to use against somebody else. So this, Africans are always there, and the reason we are there is because we don't have organization, the capacity to fight, and because we're led by these idiots and people who are sellouts and neo-colonial opportunists and what have you, who are not competent to provide leadership to protect Africa and African people. So no, Comrade Rashada, I don't know specifically about that. It's interesting that you should mention. I guarantee you that people who are listening and participate in this discussion are going to start searching right away to see what we can learn about that. Uhuru.
Uhuru, thank you so much, Chairman. And we have people asking, how do they join the movement? People in, our moderators are in the comments letting people know, but you can join the African People's Socialist Party, the Uhuru movement, the People's War at apspuhuru.org. We have regional leaders and other leaders within the comment section. So you guys make sure you check in with those forces that are asking to join, or how can they join, making sure we're arming them and reaching out to them with that information. And I just wanted to close out with this comment before going into our announcements. We have Comrade Abdullah in St. Louis who says, I can think of no person or organization more qualified to teach and lead the revolution than Chairman Omali and the APSP. The chairman possesses a vast reservoir of knowledge, wisdom, and understanding from which he is able to make plain the time and what must be done. Uhuru. And with that, again, really want to salute this brilliant study, Chairman. It was excellent, and just cannot wait for the rest of what's in store for this particular series. And just want to let everybody know, because of time, we want everyone to know that if your question was not answered, one of our moderators will correspond with you and make sure that the chairman does see your question. This study was brought to you by the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, Winning the War of Ideas. For your worldwide revolutionary news and analysis, visit theburningspear.com for all things related to the People's War Strategy, COVID-19 pandemic. We have analysis, we have health information, information on the economy, all of these different things that are related to the pandemic and just the overall colonial situation. Go to theburningspear.com. You can find this analysis and more, you know, on that website. That should be your primary news information source. That's where you go to get your info. For revolutionary radio, dynamic shows, and music by Africans all around the world, tune into Black Power 96.3 FM, broadcasting out of St. Petersburg, Florida, and accessible via our Black Power 96 app. So no matter where you are in the world, you can access Black Power 96 app. We're actually airing Omali Taught Me right now on Black Power 96. So you can go to your Apple or Android, either Google Play Store or your Apple App Store, and download Black Power. If you type in Black Power, you see Black Power 96, download that app, and or you can listen live at blackpower96.org. Again, if you united with what you heard today and you were one of those people in the comment section saying, how can I learn more? How can I join the African People's Socialist Party? Visit apspuhuru.org. No matter where you're located, visit that website and sign up to join regarding and to find more information regarding how you can apply and other information about the Uhuru movement. You can find it all right there. And we were reading today from Vanguard, the Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, and you can order your copy of this brilliant book from burningspearmarketplace.com. So go ahead and place your order for this book, and it's going to be really important and critical for your studies, and you can take this time if you have to be staying at home or quarantined to, you know, study some more. We have some really important events coming up. Join the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement's virtual Africans Charged Genocide Sunday rally, live from Impedum's international Facebook page, starting at 1 p.m. Eastern today. Sign the ACG, the Africans Charged Genocide petition, to charge the U.S. government with the genocide of Black people at africanschargedgenocide.org. We want 1 million signatures. On Wednesday, April 29th at 6:30 p.m., the African People's Education and Defense Fund, the baddest nonprofit on the planet, is conducting a live discussion and political analysis of the COVID-19 crisis and how it affects the African community, featuring, we mentioned her earlier, Dr. Aisha Fields, the International Director of the All African People's Development and Empowerment Project, which is building the Black Ankh as a concrete emergency response for African people. You can register for the Zoom event on theburningspear.com under the events tab. And APDF is, the president of APDF is Deputy Chair Omali Yeshitela, who is, I mean, her handprint is over everything in the African People's Socialist Party, is leading the economic development work for our party and really setting the foundation for a liberated African economy. On Sunday, May 3rd, beginning at 1 p.m. Eastern, the African National Women's Organization is hosting a Harriet's Daughter study group and book club discussing former Black Panther Party leader Elaine Brown's book, A Taste of Power. The purpose of the Harriet's Daughter study group and book club is to engage with African women in exploring literary themes that explain, explore, and provide strategies to overturn the oppression leveled against African people, particularly as it relates to us as African women. The books chosen by the HD Book Club may or may not represent the position of the African National Women's Organization. This event is hosted on Zoom and participants are required to register. You can access the registration details at theburningspear.com under the events tab. The Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations will host its 4th annual electoral campaign school on June 13th and 14th. Registration details for this event can be found at blackisbackcoalition.org. The African National Women's Organization's Black Women's Convention themed Sisters United for the Revolution is taking place July 10th through the 12th, and registration details can be found at ANWO, that's ANWO, uhuru.org. And especially during this time, we are calling people to follow closely the All African People's Development and Empowerment Project on Facebook, or on its website, developmentforafrica.org, for important information and helpful tips in regards to COVID-19. You know, how can we stay safe, protected, and practice, and conduct best practices during this period. and some more helpful resources. So again, Development for Africa is where you want to go for that information. Thank you all so much for tuning into this study. Make sure you like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of the Omali Taught Me Sunday Study. Uhuru.